Hi, I'm Jason Van Pelt. I work here at New Relic, one of the UI engineers. Um, and what I want to talk to you about today is the how prototyping can be a nice experience in React. And this is part one because this is not the getting to production part. This is like getting into the prototyping part of it, and kind of how that can work out really well in React. So for a little background for me getting into this is when I thought of programming before, I grew up on sci-fi. I always imagined programming, the way you see it in that basically before I got into it, which is like, oh, this is great. You sit down, you look at some alien source code, you slap the keyboard a few times, and magically the stuff you want comes out. And then you sit down and really program, and you realize that you spend, 4 hours setting up your build pipeline, and then you have to go over and figure out how to install this, module or whatever it is before you finally get to put the first thing on the screen, and then it's a little box. Okay. Um, but I've always been chasing since then that idea that it should be like it should be kind of like music. It should be like jazz. You have an idea, and you should be able to sit down at your computer and create, and minimally deal with those blockers and stuff like that. With the other frameworks, UI frameworks leading up to that, they always had something where you would get stuck inevitably in like 2 hours worth of trying to figure out what's going on. React has this great way of simplifying stuff for you. Once you get over the learning curve, which I'm sure since everybody here uses React, you've started to or have been experiencing that performance boost, that ability to just sit down and make what you want without having to be lost too much in the minutia of how to wire up everything to make it do everything, and wrestling with the framework. So in my jobs in technology, I've had various experiences with prototypes, which is like a great way to start doing something, spin up an idea. You don't always have that fully fledged out idea of what you're going to do. But mixed experiences with actually trying to prototype stuff. So, you start off with a prototype, you show it to people, you get your feedback, they love it, they say, great, write some tests, release it, ship it out there. And you've got this kind of a prototype now that's in production that you're trying to maintain. Not really the best experience. So you kind of come back on that and say, okay, well, I'll make my prototype and I'll get a little feedback on it. And then when they say they like it, I will quickly throw it away so that I can get back into a proper agile development cycle where I can make my stuff based on specs and I can test it and deploy it and get the feedback and everything else. Realistically, that prototype is still kind of there. It's more like in a recycle bin and picking from it and still kind of reusing it. So the question is, though, like that prototype phase is really kind of that creative part of it, right? I mean, once you get into the real development cycle, you can have some of that, but you're also kind of, the process is a little bit slower. How can you get more out of that prototype phase? How can you leverage it and have that tight feedback loop and kind of keep growing? Where maybe you're getting that feedback, you're brainstorming on the new ideas. Your designer says, hey, you could try such and such. And you've got this tight loop in there to really flesh out the idea and know where you're going with it before getting into that, let's make something for production now. So ideally, it's going to grow a little bit. It'll stay maintainable. They might say, oh, hey, can you show me real data with that now? Hey, can you make it do such and such? Sure, yeah. And before you know it, you might have a little service in the background where you're kind of building some APIs to wire real data, and you're kind of adding some packs in there. And then you're like, well, how do we deal with this data in here? And oh, we need this to look kind of like something, so there's some CSS. And do I need tests for this now? And at what point do you get in there? It's a little bloated. But the thing that's cool is, and this is something that my team has actually been doing because we've finally reached that point where everybody all the way up to our PM says like, yes, we want to do these prototypes. We want to prove out what we're doing before we do it. And my team has reached this point where this cycle, as scary as this looks, is actually not that bad. We're able to keep it going where for like a few weeks, we can be iterating on this prototype, building it out, getting the feedback and understanding what we're going to do with it. So what I got for you today is just kind of a little bit of an intro, like the first part of some of the things that we've done that help us get into this first phase of this tight feedback loop. And of course, in the end, you have that prototype. It still probably goes in the recycle can, but you've got a lot more that you've learned from this that you can draw from when you're getting into the real thing. So recipe for this really tight prototyping cycle. First thing is things you can do to kind of reduce cognitive load, to make it easy for yourself. So like React already does a lot of this for you by just being simple. I think we're hopefully kind of past the days where you have to spend, 2 weeks setting up a build pipeline. You can find, you can go do create React app script and you have your React app ready to go. There's a lot of other little things like that that you can do to simplify it so that you're not thinking about that. And the next thing is about being kind of intentional about the fact that your project is going to grow organically. You don't know where you're starting necessarily. You don't know where it's going to go. So you can't totally plan out what you're going to do. Um, but it's okay. It's like going with that. And refactoring as you go, some judicious hacking, um, development-driven testing, bad acronym, I don't know. Um, anyway, so that reducing cognitive load, and I'm going to get to some real code here in a bit. Um, So there's simple stuff like setting up that build pipeline. I'd advocate for actually including your CSS in that upfront. I've tried enough times where you just kind of hack in, like inline CSS all over the place because, oh, it's just a prototype. It gets bad quickly. But there's also an extra benefit to it that I'll show you when we get there. There's other like kind of mundane stuff though, like especially if you're working with a team. Where are you going to put your code? How are you going to organize things? How are you going to manage your state? Um, are there other little things you've kind of like gotten out of your last projects that helped you get a little more velocity? This all seems like total minutia, but this is the stuff that if you kind of decide up front how you're going to deal with it, then while you're being creative, you don't have to decide how you're going to deal with it. It's kind of like, you don't want to have to stop in the middle of playing a riff on your guitar and say, oh, I got to, change my strings now. Whatever. So build configs, yeah, it takes a little bit of time. There's stuff scripts out there, but it's not that bad now. You can copy and paste a whole bunch of stuff out of example Webpack stuff if you want to make your own. Not that bad. Organizing your stuff, again, total minutia, but it's the kind of thing that it's like, where you put your files, you don't have to think about it. Other people don't have to think about it. Managing state, there's a lot of stuff out there. I kind of I've grown onto the idea of like just container components because it's dead simple and the overhead is really low. Like if you already are into using Redux or other stuff like that, then it's just as easy. If you're working, for example, with people who haven't grown into the idea of using Redux or whatever else, and they want to keep it really simple, container components are great. And then other stuff that you've done, and this is where, like Kyle was talking about, if you come up with a list of like recompose things that you totally love or you've made your own, that saved you a lot of time, like bringing those in to what you've got going right now, stealing code from your past self, awesome way to go. So I thought, okay, I'm going to start off, I'm just going to do a really simple thing, go off to one of the examples that's out there. There's one of that cool blog post that React put out some years back, whatever, thinking in React, where they say, this is how you build a React thing, right? You have this thing you want to do, you break it down into what are my individual components, and you figure out where your state lives, and you do all of that, and that's great. Prototyping, you probably don't, maybe you could start that way. Or you could just jump in and write your code. Say, there's my thing, less than 100 lines of code, 80 lines of CSS, whatever, it works. But it's kind of like you organically just put it together. And then you end up with kind of a mess of code. But you didn't know maybe where it was going to start with. So the cool thing is from this point is, on one hand, you could get into this loop where you show your cool new thing to someone and they're like, oh yeah, this is nice. Can you do that? And you could just keep adding stuff in until you've loaded up to 1 million lines of code. But what you can actually do that's awesome with React is it makes it super easy if you didn't start off with nice clean code, or because you didn't know where it was going or whatever. You can kind of back yourself incrementally out of these things. You can refactor as you go, where you end up continually in this clean state. It's kind of like a reset. So when you go through that cycle, you're not getting to that point where there's so much bloat that you're at an impasse. So some code. This is that code. So you can see, like, on one hand, 80 lines of code, not too bad. Here's the render function, large enough, a little bigger. Glancing at this, it's not easy to read. It's kind of like, what does it do? I could stare at it for a couple of minutes. I could figure it out. It's a bunch of JSX kind of plunked into one thing. Cool thing about this is refactoring this stuff is really straightforward and basically breaking it out as you go along. When you get to the point where the component is big enough that it's uncomfortable, it's totally straightforward to just back up and say, clean it up and make it clear. So like simple little stuff, here's a bunch of stuff that was at the top of my component. Come in here. Boom, paste it in. I'm not going to make you watch me type code all night. Yes, I use Vim, by the way. I love Vim. It makes me feel nostalgic. And then somewhere over here, I have it still running, presumably. Still works, does its thing. Cool thing about this is like this little step, like an incremental refactor that you got, you've already got a bit more of readable stuff in there. Same deal, you can pull this out, render your list. And what you got out of this actually is not just like, you know, an actually readable render function out of this, but you've got the beginnings of components already starting from it. So like, hopefully it still works. Ah, oh yeah, there's some more junk in here. Good enough. And it's like, I'm not showing all of you like doing this live to show that I can code, but it's like, it's this quick and easy to show that, it's like how quickly you can start to pull stuff out. And you can actually at least see what this component is doing. And then another simple step after this is where you get to, like this render list, you can see basically is its own component is taking shape already. It's super simple to extract this out. And you got this nice little hint, you notice, like, because I had nested things inside of nested things, you look at all these class names that are taking shape, everything is a list item, label, price. And it's like this clear signal, like there's a component waiting in here to be extracted that just kind of grew up organically. So I'm just going to do a quick jumping up to this point. So like extracting that component out, you've got like your simple scrolling list now. That's its own separate component where you can see basically just copy and pasted the same code straight out of here. Got a new component in there. And then same thing with your CSS that you had in there, which is basically just copied and pasted out of the original that built up organically. So the point is, in the end, is like, it's not like this is super exciting. It's basically that it is super simple, cool. That allowing this component to kind of grow up and get a little bit messy is okay. It's not scary because backing out of that and continually getting back to where it's another simple thing is a straightforward task. Another aspect out of this is you will run into those difficult impasses. You'll run into something like, oh crap, it's actually really a challenge to manage all the URL state and params that you're passing around through a bunch of components, or figuring out, how do you do your routing? Those sorts of things kind of feed back into the cycle of like next prototype. You've got some of those challenges turn into your side little projects where you can make this helper that you can feed into the next one, and you get to the point. Or there again, like if you're using recompose elements to solve these, or if you're using some other type of solution, that it kind of grows back into itself to where you get to this productive prototyping cycle. So that's little part one. I could have like a future talk basically about how we experience growing from those prototypes to the real things. How do we take those lessons and actually get these to production?
Any questions before we wrap the night up?
Yeah.
Coming back. Easy playground mode and then making it something somebody else can read more easily. I was wondering if you could give more examples of places where you ran into trouble, so I know ahead of time.
Well, yeah, like it's funny, like the one I mentioned about just managing the URL state was actually one of the more surprisingly challenging ones, because when you get into, you have a few container components, different things caring about which params are coming from the URL, which one of those are default, how do you feed in defaults, stuff like that, actually proved to be really painful, to the extent that at some point we're going to stop and make some kind of a helper that is specifically for managing that kind of stuff. Um, that's yeah. There's been other little things around state management that have been kind of tricky. And I think a good example. That's actually the nice thing. It's been going pretty smoothly with the recent stuff. Yeah.
Here's what you think about. Do you think it's better to fail faster or to try to get it right in a prototype?
Um, think failing fast is pretty good. You know, you find out quickly what works and what doesn't, and you're going to run into things that are going to be blockers. Um, Actually, one of the other things, kind of tying the two questions together, the most recent router prototyping we were working on was very data intensive, and it was kind of funny. We had like a node service in the background because it's great to prototype onto. To the extent that we kind of had some code leaking back and forth between the two. It's like, oh, this really shouldn't be here. It should be in the service. Um, but that process, particularly of when we're trying to munge a lot of data that we and into the shape that the UI wants, um, introduces a lot of complexity. But you also quickly find out where it's going to work and where it isn't going to work, what you can do with it, maybe how you need to change it, and it can inform things like, how do you need to design that API? Yeah.
Yeah, my question's kind of similar. You kind of started out saying or proposing that we should do more real data wiring up prototypes versus, and proof of concepts versus maybe just kind of a mock-up or something. And I've always struggled with that, especially at the big company I just came from, where we would put developer resources to build out something, and then the product owners would not give us a lot of time. We'd build it scrappy, and then that thing would turn into a product that we would then have
Uh-huh.
a ton of technical debt built into it right from the beginning. And then as a team lead, I would try to push back and say, hey, why can't we get our designers in InVision to actually use InVision to wire up state and show actual state? And the designers would say, oh, well, that would take so much time. But it doesn't take nearly, not even a fraction of the time it takes for developers to actually build out and make it functional. So, again, kind of where do you draw the line between iterating fast and proving out a concept with real data and actual code?
Yeah, totally. And that's been that can be challenging. There's some nice in-between things you can do in there, which is especially because React lends itself so well to prototyping, developing those mockups. You can go from the other end and basically mock out your APIs or push that a level out further. Like you can have mock data in the UI, which is kind of cumbersome. It works. But actually, a thing I played with on this was originally I was just generating mock data in here and feeding that in from my container. But I just randomly Googled. It's like, oh, here's a free API mocker that you can do. And I just literally went in and pasted data that I was generating from the browser um, in, and then it returns that data. So at least from the UI perspective, step one, you've got it actually making a query out to some endpoint with the data, the shape of the data that you would expect. Um, and it is acting in a real way. Wiring up to real data is tricky, but that's where, for example, like we've been working using a node service because it's so quick to work in, and as long as there is an API for your data somewhere, it's a little bit more work, but it's basically almost as easy as if you were generating pretend data inside your UI.
One more question.
All right, just one quick question. For those sub-render functions that you were creating, what type of rule of thumb do you use to like say, okay, now this should be a class of its own or it's a component of its own versus, well, this is good enough to just be like this dot, header thing on this component. Like when do you strip it out into its own component?
Yeah, that's like a interesting balance to strike on there. A couple of things I look at is, am I having to process any of the props in any way to get them into the shape they need to be to render it is one thing. Like I had in here, in the original version of this, the list items were being filtered and stuff like that. That was a pretty clear indication I was doing something with the data that should be pulled out in some way. If there's any depth in the nesting, or any large number of elements that you're rendering in there, that's a pretty good sign. I mean, this, or for example, when I was pointing out, like even the CSS, that's the cool thing. One of the reasons why I really like getting the CSS in there in the start. You start seeing yourself having to like namespace your class names, and like this is the list header, and this is the list body, and this is the list such and such. And basically at that point, it's like the component shines a spotlight on itself and says, it's time to take me out. You know?
All right. That'll be it. Thank you very much.